mean, as you said, we're about 1% of the American population, but we're, I'd say, influential beyond our numbers, and that's a somewhat recent thing. And Barack Obama, whatever else you think about him, and he kept his distance from the Muslim community. He kept us at arm's length, and understandably so, because he was perceived as Muslim by a surprisingly large number of Republican voters, but also, I mean, a lot of us Muslims joke that he was the first Muslim president and all that stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't want to emphasize that too much because people might get the wrong idea. I mean, I don't actually think Obama was Muslim. It's just like but he is like sort of part of the family in some sense, you know?
Yeah.
In a sort of counterintuitive way, Donald Trump's election was obviously very worrying and frightening for a lot of us. And I remember trying to process what his victory meant the day after, the weeks after, and even in the lead up to the election. I think there were some worst case scenarios where we're like, how bad could this actually get?
Yeah.
And there was almost, I remember that I had the talk with my parents. There was sort of a Muslim version of the talk where it's like, hey, if it gets really bad, what are our backup options here? And my dad is also a Canadian citizen. So half jokingly, but also I think half seriously, we had a conversation where he was like, hey, just so you're aware, and sometimes I forget that my dad still has his Canadian citizenship, but it's like, there is a path to citizenship if you, I don't know exactly how it works, but God forbid, there is a sort of a backup option here. So there was that side of Trump's election, but in a way, Trump also propelled us into the cultural mainstream in a brand new way. That because Trump was so obsessed with us, and this is starting with the campaign, with the proposed Muslim ban and all of that, he made us a centerpiece of the national conversation. And because of that, I remember in 2015, everyone was talking about us. We had become an object of other people's conversations. And when Trump actually became president, what that meant for the Democratic Party was one way to signal your anti-Trump credentials was to be very pro-Muslim. And it was a way to kind of be like, oh, Trump, look, he has this obsession with Muslims. He doesn't like Muslims. So we're going to be the opposite of whatever he's doing.
Right.
And I like that. It's good because the Democratic Party really came out defending Muslims and opposing the Muslim ban and the various iterations of the Muslim ban, there were like 3 or 4 or whatever. So there was a moment in 2017 where a lot of this stuff was coming to a head. And I think that there were also more Muslim voices that were willing to speak out on behalf of their Muslim identity, people who weren't very visibly Muslim before. Aziz Ansari is an interesting case who became more vocal about Islamophobia, even though before 2017, Aziz Ansari was very open about saying that he didn't consider himself theologically Muslim. He wasn't religious. He wasn't a believer. But Trump sort of, he made even people who weren't very Muslim, in quotation marks, feel a need to speak up. Because we seemed Muslim, we were visibly Muslim. So I think those dynamics are really interesting to look at. And then we see later on the rise of very visibly Muslim politicians like Ilhan and Rashida Tlaib and so on. And that's interesting because even though I think there's a debate in the Muslim community about how much we like or don't like, we shouldn't presume that all Muslims like Ilhan and Rashida. That said, we are all sort of on a first name basis with them. Even when we talk about them amongst ourselves, hey, what do you think about Ilhan? Or hey, did you see what Rashida said the other day?
Yeah.
And as it turns out, it just shows you also what a small world this is. A good friend, Rashida, is actually roommates with one of my good friends here in D.C. Okay, but I don't know. Okay, but I don't know if we're supposed to be public about that.
Okay,
About
so I'll
just.
I'll edit that part out. We'll just say beep. Yeah, that's funny.
But I remember, yeah. So it's just like interesting that
Yeah.
it's like we're all like 2 degrees from. Anyway, yeah. So, but to get to your bigger question about, so then there's also the mainstreaming of the um, the mainstreaming of the predominant Muslim position on Israel Palestine. Again, I don't want to. We have to be careful about overgeneralizing. There isn't a Muslim position on Israel Palestine, but
Of
I think
course.
it's fair to say that the vast majority of American Muslims are at least to one degree or another pro-Palestinian, in the sense that they don't like the idea of Palestinians being killed or repressed by Israeli occupation forces. That's a fair, I think, generalization to make. There are major differences, though, on one state versus two state
Right.
and things like that. But most American Muslims think that the U.S. government is too unquestioningly pro-Israeli. And I think that if you look at the Democratic Party, there has been a major shift. And one thing that we really emphasize in our piece is that there has been a sea change in how the Democratic Party talks about Israel, Palestine. And I think we, as American Muslims, have become become part of that. I mean, that we're no longer an outlier. We're not the ones who sort of have to uh, we don't have to kind of
You don't have to
not
explain
talk.
yourselves per se. It's sort of like it's out in the open in a sense. That now
Yeah,
it's easy to engage this topic as opposed to just a few years ago. You almost seemed like you're on the fringe when you'd bring
yeah,
up.
exactly.
Yeah.
No longer on the fringe, and we're in the mainstream of the party because the party has changed and has become more willing to speak out on behalf of Palestinian rights to
Hmm.
various degrees. But you saw that, I think, certainly, even the fact that Bernie Sanders, the fact that he would say things that would be quite controversial 5 years ago or 10 years ago, talking about um, conditionality with U.S. military aid to Israel. That
Hmm.
used to be a third rail of the American public conversation. No one used to talk about that. But he would bring up these issues, and they weren't even that controversial.
Right.
And people were like, oh, that's Bernie. And the fact that you could speak out about those things without it ruining your career, without it making it impossible for you to be the front runner, and let's recall that Bernie for like 2 weeks was the front runner, that tells us something about the shifting discourse within the Democratic Party. And we can talk about this more, but how Israel-Palestine isn't just about Israel-Palestine.
Right.
It's a proxy for a deeper set of ethical commitments on progressive foreign policy.